Thank you, Chairman Byer, and I'm glad to be here to be a part of this hearing. People have had to make really hard decisions throughout the pandemic when it comes to their jobs and protecting themselves and their families and their communities. I don't think we've taken stock, really, of the trauma visited upon all of us at varying levels as a result of this pandemic. And not everybody's had the privilege of working remotely. I think especially about our essential workers. That's a term that emerged during the pandemic. The people who literally risked their lives stocking grocery store shelves and working in other facilities and hospitals in some cases. We call them essential workers. Often they don't make an essential wage. They don't earn essential benefits. Leading into the pandemic, only about 9% of the lowest wage earners in the country were able to work from home. Dr. Stevenson, can you speak to how policies that support the financial freedom of working families, like the child tax credit, the largest tax cut for working families in American history, how this might affect the growth and stability of the labor market?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think the most important thing that the child tax credit does is eliminates or dramatically reduces the amount of children living in poverty. And what that does for children is ensures that they eat better, that they learn better, and that they're better able to grow into adults who will ultimately be productive. But it also gives a little bit more flexibility to the families to make the right choices for them. Families shouldn't be stuck in a situation where if something happens, we've all been there, where a kid breaks an arm or a leg, and you have to keep going to work, but who's gonna take care of them? Giving them just a little bit more breathing room allows them to make better decisions. And we saw in the pandemic that people got up and went to jobs that could kill them. But the financial support we gave has allowed them to move into better jobs as we've emerged out of the pandemic, to make requests for higher wages, for more flexibility. Flexibility doesn't just mean working at home. It means knowing what your schedule is more than 24 hours in advance so you can plan for childcare. It means trying to ask for working around your childcare schedule so that you can actually go to work and do your job. These kinds of demands that workers are now currently making are being facilitated by the fact that you and Congress, in its wisdom, has chosen to give a little bit more of a cushion to families so that they can make better choices for them and their children.
Families for whom wages are low and the cost of child care is high.
Yes.
And this just gives them some space. So you don't believe that this is a negative impact on the economy?
I do not believe it's a negative impact. In fact, I think it's a very strongly positive impact on the economy. I think that most people want to be able to work, provide more for their children, but they need a little bit of a buffer, because when things start to fall apart, what we see is people can have a really hard time getting themselves out of the worst situations. So that's particularly true for low-wage workers.
And similarly, we've heard folks in recent days say that the unemployment insurance that we provided is what's contributing to this issue. And some have argued that taking away unemployment payments was necessary to get people back to work. But the evidence that I've seen isn't there. In states like Georgia that ended benefits early, there was not a significant difference in the number of jobs created in comparison to other states that kept the benefits. Further, a report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta found that even though women with small children made up just 10% of the pre-pandemic workforce, they are almost 25% of the COVID-related job loss. So these are folks who are responding to this very issue that you're talking about. It's not that parents don't want to work. Raising a small child, and I have two small children, during a pandemic without reliable child care or other supports. It's a full-time job, and it makes it nearly impossible to work. Mr. Amernath, does limiting Americans' access to financial support increase our overall economic growth?
I think it's quite clearly the opposite from the past 18 months. We have some pretty clear data about how income supports ultimately preserve consumption, preserve jobs, preserve the ability for businesses to stay open and not have to go bankrupt. And that's true especially from on the household side with unemployment insurance. So there was obviously a lot talked about disincentives, how this was actually stopping people from entering. And we had a few different ways we could actually game out where this was actually happening. Leave aside whether the incentive, how much of an effect it was having. We could look at the cutoff in September for a lot of states who actually kept it in place. And did job growth speed up as we got closer to September and through September? No. We can look at the states, we have weekly data for states that cut it off early. And did we see a difference in terms of how quickly their employment rates accelerated through that early cutoff? And we didn't see that either. That's to reference what Dr. Stevenson noted in her testimony that Erin Dubé has from the weekly data, we don't see that. And then we can also just look at across the income spectrum. Do we see that when we gave a fixed payment, did it actually translate into people at the lower end of the income spectrum? Did job growth slow for those who are at the lowest wage level? That we didn't see either. So we have all these different ways to triangulate and actually evaluate this. And I'm sure there's obviously ways we can keep going back and forth, but on the other side of the ledger, that income helped support consumption for a lot of people who otherwise would have had to cut back drastically. And that's a really important thing. The share of people who would have had to face a big financial loss in terms of a lack of employment, who didn't have to go through that. There's pretty clear data. JP Morgan has evaluated people's financial balances across the income spectrum. And there were a number of people who would have faced a really big financial downturn because of the loss of employment that didn't have to. And that meant that they could also be engaged in economic activity that was supportive of their own standard of living and the standard of living of others.
Thank you so much. I often say that the right thing to do is often the smart thing to do as well. And this gives us insight about how to grow the economy in a way that embraces all of us, especially hardworking, middle-class people, the working poor. Thank you so much.